The sound of an empire collapsing is rarely a thunderous crash, but rather a slow, grinding erosion that goes unnoticed by those living within its borders. In the 2nd century AD, a Roman citizen walking through the Forum would have seen marble columns still standing wide and tall, yet the mortar holding the civilization together was already turning to dust. Today, a similar quiet tension permeates the streets of Washington and Wall Street, where the structures of power remain intact, but the underlying foundations of economic stability are showing profound signs of structural fatigue. We are witnessing the convergence of historical cycles that have toppled superpowers before, driven by the same immutable laws of debt, currency debasement, and geopolitical overreach that dismantled the legions of Rome. This is not a prediction of doom based on fear, but an analysis of pattern recognition drawn from the archives of economic history and the ledgers of central banks. The question is not whether the cycle exists, but rather where we currently stand within its arc and what mechanisms are accelerating the timeline. To understand the gravity of the present moment, we must first establish why this comparison matters beyond mere academic curiosity or sensationalist headlines. The United States currently holds the position of global hegemon that Rome once occupied, commanding the reserve currency of the world and maintaining a military presence across every known continent. However, the metrics used to measure imperial health are flashing warnings that mirror the data from the 3rd century crisis of the Roman Empire. Inflation is eroding purchasing power, political polarization is preventing necessary fiscal reforms, and the cost of maintaining global security is outpacing the economic growth required to fund it. These are not isolated incidents, but interconnected symptoms of a system reaching the limits of its expansion. When the cost of servicing debt begins to consume the revenue needed for public infrastructure and social stability, the state faces a choice between default or debasement. Rome chose debasement, and the United States is currently navigating the same narrow path through quantitative easing and deficit spending. Let us rewind the clock to the height of the Roman Empire, specifically to the reign of Nero in 64 AD, where the first significant cracks in the monetary system appeared. Following the Great Fire of Rome, the imperial treasury was depleted, and Nero faced the classic dilemma of a state spending more than it collects in taxes. Instead of reducing expenditure or increasing efficiency, Nero ordered the reduction of silver content in the denarius, the standard currency of the realm. This was not a one-time event, but the beginning of a centuries-long trend where successive emperors diluted the currency to pay the legions and fund public games. By the time of Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century, the silver content of the denarius had dropped by over 90%, leading to hyperinflation that wiped out savings and destroyed the merchant class. Historical records from the period describe prices doubling within weeks, forcing the government to issue the Edict on Prices in 301 AD to cap costs by decree. This command economy failed spectacularly because it ignored the fundamental reality that currency value is derived from trust and scarcity, not imperial fiat. The narrative deepens when we examine the social and political consequences of this monetary decay, which mirrored the economic collapse. As the currency lost value, the Roman government increasingly demanded taxes in kind, requiring farmers to deliver grain and goods directly to the state rather than coin. This shift burdened the agricultural base and tied workers to the land, creating the early structures of serfdom that would define the Middle Ages. The elite class, sensing the instability, began moving their wealth out of the empire and into landholdings that were less susceptible to currency manipulation. This capital flight weakened the central government's ability to project power, leading to a reliance on mercenary forces who lacked loyalty to the Roman ideal. The legions, once composed of citizen soldiers fighting for the Republic, became privatized armies, loyal to whichever general could pay them the most. This fragmentation of military loyalty culminated in the Year of the Five Emperors, where political stability was held hostage by the highest bidder. The internal cohesion of the state was sacrificed for short-term solvency, creating a vacuum that external rivals were eager to fill. Behind these historical events lies a specific economic mechanism that drives the life cycle of reserve currencies and imperial power. The cycle begins with a rise in productivity and strong institutions that generate surplus wealth, allowing the state to build military strength and attract global capital. As the empire expands, the cost of maintaining borders and policing trade routes increases, requiring higher levels of debt to sustain the status quo. Eventually, the interest payments on this debt consume a significant portion of the state's revenue, forcing the central bank or monetary authority to monetize the debt by printing money. This monetization leads to currency depreciation, which reduces the real value of the debt, but also erodes the purchasing power of the citizens. As living standards decline, internal conflict rises, and the political center struggles to hold against populist movements demanding redistribution. Meanwhile, external rivals, who have maintained fiscal discipline, begin to challenge the hegemon's dominance, offering alternative trade settlements and security arrangements. This mechanism is described in detail by economic historians like Ray Dalio and Carmen Reinhardt, who track these cycles across centuries of data. When we overlay this mechanism onto the current geopolitical landscape, the parallels between the Roman denarius and the US dollar become unsettlingly clear. The United States dollar serves as the global reserve currency, allowing America to run persistent trade deficits and borrow heavily in its own currency without immediate consequence. However, since the abandonment of the gold standard in 1971, the dollar has lost over 90% of its purchasing power, mirroring the debasement trajectory of the Roman coin. The Federal Reserve has engaged in unprecedented expansion of the money supply to mitigate economic downturns, effectively monetizing government debt to keep interest rates manageable. This policy has inflated asset prices for the wealthy, while increasing the cost of living for the average worker, creating a wealth gap that rivals the disparity seen in late imperial Rome. Political discourse has become increasingly polarized, with fiscal responsibility taking a backseat to short-term stimulus measures designed to win elections rather than secure long-term stability. The military budget remains colossal, stretching resources across multiple theaters of conflict while domestic infrastructure crumbles from neglect. There are hidden forces and power structures within this system that incentivize the continuation of these trends despite the long-term risks. The financial sector benefits from asset inflation and low interest rates, which increase the value of holdings and reduce the cost of leverage for large institutions. Government contractors rely on sustained military expenditure, creating a lobby that resists downsizing even when strategic objectives are unclear. Political elites benefit from the ability to spend without immediate taxation, deferring the cost to future generations through bond issuance. These incentives create a feedback loop, where the immediate interests of the powerful align with policies that degrade the long-term health of the nation. This is not a conspiracy, but a structural outcome of a system where accountability is disconnected from consequence. In Rome, the Praetorian Guard auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder because the institution had become a vehicle for personal enrichment rather than public security. Today, regulatory capture allows large corporations to write the rules that govern their industries, ensuring profits remain privatized while risks are socialized. The alignment of elite incentives against the broader public interest accelerates the decay of institutional trust. The acceleration phase of this cycle is currently underway, driven by the speed of modern information and the interconnectedness of global finance. In Rome, news of a currency debasement might take weeks to travel from the capital to the provinces, allowing the government to maintain the illusion of stability for a time. Today, market participants react to fiscal data in milliseconds, and capital can flee a currency instantly at the first sign of weakness. The rise of alternative payment systems and the exploration of central bank digital currencies by rival nations indicate a desire to bypass the dollar-dominated SWIFT system. Nations like China and Russia are increasingly settling trade in local currencies, reducing their exposure to U.S. sanctions and monetary policy. This fragmentation of the global financial system reduces the demand for dollars, which could force interest rates higher as the U.S. struggles to find buyers for its debt. If the cost of borrowing rises significantly, the government will face a stark choice between austerity measures that could trigger a depression or further money printing that could trigger hyperinflation. The window for a soft landing is closing as the structural imbalances become too large to correct through gradual reform. The climax of this historical narrative reveals a big truth that is often obscured by daily news cycles and political rhetoric. Empires do not fall because of a single event or a specific enemy, but because they lose the internal capacity to adapt to changing realities. Rome did not fall solely because of barbarian invasions. It fell because it could no longer afford the legions required to keep the barbarians at bay. The United States faces a similar constraint, where the commitments made to the global order exceed the economic capacity to sustain them. The revelation here is that the solution is not necessarily a collapse into chaos, but a painful restructuring of expectations and obligations. History shows that societies can navigate these transitions if they acknowledge the reality of their constraints and act decisively to restore balance. However, this requires a level of political courage and collective sacrifice that is rare in the late stages of a cycle. The denial of the problem is often more dangerous than the problem itself, as it delays the necessary adjustments until the crisis becomes unmanageable. We are currently in the phase where denial is the dominant strategy, masking the severity of the fiscal hole with complex financial instruments and optimistic projections. In the end, the story of Rome is not just a warning, but a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities inherent in any complex human system. The marble columns may still stand, and the military may still possess superior firepower, but the strength of a nation lies in the integrity of its currency and the cohesion of its people. When money becomes meaningless and citizens feel disconnected from the project of the state, The foundation is compromised regardless of how impressive the facade appears. The United States has advantages that Rome did not, including technological innovation, demographic resilience, and a history of constitutional correction. Yet, the economic laws that governed the ancient world still apply to the digital age because they are based on human behavior and resource limits. The future will be determined by whether the current generation recognizes the pattern and chooses to break the cycle before the momentum becomes irreversible. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes with a consistency that demands our attention. The silence of the crumbling mortar is getting louder, and it is up to us to decide whether we will listen before the walls come down. If this documentary made you think, subscribe to the channel. More deep, fact-based analysis on history, finance, and geopolitics is coming, beyond the headlines and the noise.